Students, today we'll discuss about the Oedipus complex in Sons and Lovers. So first of all, I'll tell you what this term means and from where it is derived. The term Oedipus has been derived from the name of the king Oedipus of Thebes, who, though in ignorance, married his own mother. The Oedipus complex is a state in which a person shows excessive affection for the parent opposite in sex to him or herself and a corresponding distaste for his or her other parent. So, Freud was the first one who used this term to explain uh, these, say, feelings or the manifestation of these feelings in the relation of the child to his or her parent. It is now a well known fact that D.H. Lawrence himself was the victim of a deep rooted Oedipus complex. His mother, Lydia Lawrence, had a very strong hold on him, and he too treated his mother like a lover. It was she who gave him life warmth. His orientation into life and literature also depended on the inspiration she gave him. In 1910, when Mrs. Lawrence was virtually on deathbed, Lawrence wrote to his publisher to make haste with the publication of The White Peacock, his first novel, so that his mother could see it. That they have loved each other like young lovers is repeatedly expressed in his early poems also. For example, in Monologue of Mother, the mother talks of her strange son, I quote, whom I have waited like a lover. And there is also on record a conversation between Lawrence and Jessie, the girl he loved, just a day before his mother's funeral. And I'm just quoting a piece of that conversation. He said to Jessie, "You know, I've always loved mother." And she replies, "I know you have." Then he says, "I don't mean that. I loved her like a lover. That's why I could never love you." And this actual situation, Lawrence has tried to project in his novel Sons and Lovers. Clearly, the effect is cathartic, though the situations in the novel and the real life did not take the same course later on. Now, if we talk about the Oedipus in Sons and Lovers, Graham Hoff, in his discussion of Sons and Lovers in The Dark Sun, says that, I quote, the whole situation in the novel presents the Freudian Oedipus imbroglio in almost classic completeness. Unquote. Disillusioned with her husband Walter Morrill, Mrs. Morrill, or say Paul's mother Gertrude, gradually casts him off and takes her two sons, William and Paul, as husband substitutes, one after the other. And in this way, she destroys their emotional life, or say romantic life. If we just talk about the plot or the storyline, you all know that the first few months of Walter and Gertrude's married life are extremely happy, but gradually the feeble bond of their poetized passion ends, and Mrs. Morrill feels disgusted with her husband's habitual drunkenness and his coarseness and his temperamental dishonesty and his irresponsible attitude towards family. As her eldest son William grows up, Mrs. Morrel begins to alienate Walter Morrel and seek emotional fulfillment through her son. And William also instinctively responds to her. But Mrs. Morrel is so overpossessive that as William comes in contact with other girls and goes dancing with them, she finds it difficult to tolerate them. In fact, she expresses her hostility towards them in rather crude terms. And later, when William falls in love with a girl called Zip and brings her home on a short visit from London, she is very critical of her. Under her influence, William finds it difficult to strike a balanced emotional relationship with Zip. Torn with conflict between his love for his mother and his, say, infatuation or love with Zip, he suffers from terrible spiritual and emotional anguish. He and finally he dies. Then Gertrude's attention transfers to Paul, her second son. As Paul grows up, he sticks to his mother and trots after her like her shadow. She too clings to him and encourages him into an abject contempt of his father, and he loves to sleep with his mother. According to Freud, the Oedipus complex remains dormant for a few years after the early infantile psychosexual development and is reanimated at the time of puberty. In the case of Paul, the early migration to London of William helps in a quickening of his fixation for his mother, though it is finally recognized only when Paul is down with a severe attack of pneumonia after William's death. Mrs. Morrel lies with him at nights and tightens her grip over his soul in a desperate bid to save him from the clutches of death. And it is during this illness that Paul realizes his mother, and he is precisely at the age of puberty at that time. The Oedipus complex is bound to entail the envy of the father. The child looks at his father as a rival in his domination over his mother's love, though it happens quite unconsciously. Thus, there generated a feeling of hatred and hostility between the father and the son. And Paul really hates his father in the novel. Paul can never stand even the look of his father and scornfully resists all his attempts to be tender with him. On the other hand, Mrs. Morrel's overmothering of Paul incites much jealousy, accompanied with some vague notion of incest assumption in the mind of her husband. And when you read the text, you'll see that in chapter 8 there is a very significant episode that brings into focus the entire conflict. Mrs. Morrel expresses her jealousy of Miriam and then suddenly says, I quote, "And I have never, Paul, I have never had a husband, not really," unquote. Paul strokes his mother's hair and his mouth is on her throat. And she kisses him a long, fervent kiss, which is followed by a gentle stroking of her face by Paul. And just at this moment enters Mr. Morrel, and standing in the doorway, he venomously remarks, I quote, "At your mischief again?" Unquote. A fierce combat might have followed, but Mrs. Morrel faints and the quarrel is averted. When she regains her consciousness, Paul very emphatically exhorts her to sleep with Annie and not with his father. The scene begins with Mrs. Morrel's confession that she never had a husband in the real sense and ends with Paul's ostentatious assumption of that role. And in fact, throughout the second half of the novel, Paul's relation with his mother is that of a husband substitute. He instinctively sticks to her as if he were her man. And such a relation is bound to affect the wholesome sexual relationship with any other woman. And consequently, Paul fails to strike balanced relationships both with Miriam as well as Clara. In chapter 13, Paul tells his mother that he loved Clara deeply. He had loved Miriam also, but at the same time could not possibly marry them. And his mother says, I quote, "You haven't met the right woman." And what he replies, again I quote, "And I never shall meet the right woman while you live." Unquote. Both spiritually and physically, Paul is glued to his mother. The pull she wields is so strong to allow any other center of attraction in the field to retain any vitality. Paul must always be seeking for mother image in his woman. Miriam could be a mother substitute, but at the spiritual level. So long as Mrs. Morrel is living, she can at best excite rivalry, and at the physical level, because of her negative spirituality, she can only drain manliness out of Paul. Clara is simply rejected because Paul fails to find in her the mother image. But while Paul gets dissatisfied both with Miriam and Clara, he clings on to his mother. Their interdependence on each other never declines. Although, in conclusion, although we can say that Sons and Lovers has been described as the first Freudian novel in English, it does present the Freudian Oedipus complex, but the concept of its story was not altered by Freud's theories. Lawrence had already completed the first draft of his novel before he became acquainted with the ideas of Freud. In 1912, when Lawrence was in Germany, Freud was one of the topics commonly discussed with Freda. But since Lawrence was trying to understand his own experience, it is most unlikely that he altered the story to conform to the theories of Freud. Graham Hoff is right when he says that what Freud could and almost certainly did do is to set a theoretical seal on a situation that had been very thoroughly explored in actuality, obviously by D.H. Lawrence in his novel Sons and Lovers. So, this novel, Sons and Lovers, in a very obvious way, portrays or say the Oedipus complex is present in this novel. That's all, student. Thank you.